Let's get started on Chapter 11, Supporting a Small Business Network. In this chapter, we will look at designing a small business network, network recommendations, hardware recommendations, system software, application software, communication software, communicating with the outside world, SOHO, small office, home office, wireless router, and remote administration. When you are designing a network for a new small business, you determine the needs of the business and you make recommendations. For example, you recommend the type of network. For a medium to large sized organization, for a server-based network, you would implement the domain-based model. However, in a small network, a SOHO, with 4 or 6 users working together, you would probably implement a peer-to-peer network and use a home group. You recall we discussed the domain model earlier in the class. When you're implementing the domain model of networking, you have a domain controller, which is a login server, and on the domain controller is Active Directory, which is the database of usernames and passwords. And the users stand at the workstation and log in to or authenticate to the domain controller. Frequently, there are multiple domain controllers for fault tolerance. Here at the Community College of Baltimore County, we have 2 domain controllers at each one of the main campuses. 2 domain controllers at Essex, 2 domain controllers at Catonsville, and 2 domain controllers at Dundalk. However, in a small organization, a limiting factor can be the cost of the domain controllers. In a small office, home office, where you only have 4 to 6 people working together, you would typically implement the peer-to-peer networking design where there is no domain controller. You just can't justify the cost of a domain controller when you only have 4 or 6 people working there. To implement sharing in a small office, home office, we use a home group. Page 405 discusses what is meant by a home group. If we go into Control Panel and we select Network and Internet, and then we select Home Group, we can see the description. With a home group, you can share files and printers with other computers running Windows 7 and Windows 8 and Windows 9. Currently, there is no home group on the network. So the home group allows us to share files with other computers in the home group. So let's create a home group. To create a home group, we click on Create Home Group. Then we specify the files and folders that we would like to share with our co-workers in the home group and click on Next, and it generates the home group. And then it displays a password. This password is used for other computers when they add themselves to the home group, and this password links all the computers together in the home group. After you have created the home group and the computers have been added to the home group, then you can implement sharing. Here's the example. I've got a folder called Data Files which I want to share with my co-workers. So I right-click on that folder and I select Share With. Now, I could select Share With Nobody, in which case it wouldn't be shared at all. Or I could share it with everybody in the home group and just give them the read permission so they could see the data but they couldn't edit it. Or I could give the home group the read and the write permission so people could read and edit data. Or I could give different people different permissions to the files. If you have a medium to large size organization, you would typically implement the domain model and use domain controllers. But with a small office, home office, you typically implement a peer-to-peer network and use a home group to allow for file sharing. Now let's turn to page 511, equipping a small business network. When you set up a new small business network, you buy the hardware, you buy the software, and you set it up. Let's talk about the hardware first. You would buy workstations and you would buy servers. If you have 5 employees, if you have 500 employees, typically every employee gets a workstation. Now maybe everybody would get a desktop if they stayed at their desks all the time, or maybe you might issue everybody a laptop which they could use at work as well as at home. And then you would probably get a server as well. You might have a single server, a single multifunction server that could function as a login server or a file server or a print server. Or, as the organization got larger, you might want to get multiple dedicated servers. One dedicated server to be the print server, one dedicated server to be the file server. And then to connect everybody together, you would probably get a switch and use twisted pair cable to hook everybody together using gigabit Ethernet. But so many offices, they don't even feel like running the cable when they can just use their existing wireless router. The wireless router contains the wireless access point. The wireless access point allows the workstations to connect to the servers without having to run the cables. And of course that requires that you have a wireless network interface card in the workstations and in the servers. And then of course you would typically have one shared network printer that everybody could access. Now let's look at system software. Client operating system would be the operating system on the workstations. And most likely you would get Windows 7 or Windows 8 or Windows 9 on the workstations. And then the network operating system software that you would use might be Windows 2008 Server or 2012 Server. Many people like Linux Server. And then the network operating systems that would come with the software when you bought it would include Active Directory for authentication, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol for the issuance of IP addresses, and DNS to perform hostname resolution. And of course, all workstations and servers would need TCP/IP as a communications protocol so they could communicate. Application software. Most likely every user would get Microsoft Office for word processing and spreadsheet. And then for communications, either for communications with customers or communications with co-workers, the employees would use the Internet Explorer, which you don't have to purchase separately. It's built into the operating system. And frequently so much business is done using the Internet Explorer over the web. And then of course for communication, either with co-workers or with customers, we would need email. And there are 2 ways to go there. You could get your own Microsoft Exchange server. And if you're a large enough organization, then you could justify the cost and the trouble of getting your own email server. But if you are a small organization of 4 to 6 people, it would be more practical to use Gmail. Now, when you have your own server, you control it, and it's more secure, but it's also more trouble. With Gmail, somebody else manages it. It's a much cheaper way to go. Business software. Virtually all businesses do payroll, and most of them do inventory and general ledger, and they use accounting software. Accounting software can be used for accounts payable, accounts receivable, general ledger, and payroll. And 2 very commonly used accounting software packages. One is Sage Peachtree. Sage Peachtree, complete accounting multi-user software, does inventory, payroll, accounts payable, accounts receivable, multi-user version, $700, and that's low end. That's the small business version. And then another very commonly used business software is Intuit, and Intuit offers payroll, accounts receivable, accounts payable, general ledger. Page 515 discusses communicating with the outside world. And we've just discussed building the network, but we haven't discussed communicating with the outside world. To communicate with the outside world, you would need a connection to the internet, such as a Comcast cable TV connection or a Verizon DSL. You would need a cable modem, a router, a switch, most likely a wireless access point, a DHCP server, a network address translation server, and a firewall. And the first thing that you would need would be the connection to the internet. So that would be the cable TV connection and the cable modem. So that would be the first component that you would need. Then the cable modem would connect to a router. And the router would probably have a firewall on it. Then the router would connect to a switch, which would connect to PCs, and which would connect to the server. And the server would most likely be functioning as a DHCP server. And then to connect to our wireless network, we connect a wireless access point to our switch, and this allows the wireless devices to connect to the wireless access point. And of course, another switch and PCs could plug in to the wireless access point. So all of these components are necessary to connect to the outside world. In this example, every single one of these components is a separate electronic device. Separate modem, separate router, separate switch, separate wireless access point. In a large organization, these will all be separate devices. Now, let's look at network in a small office, home office. A wireless router can perform all of the other functions. A wireless router is a router, it's a wireless access point, it's a switch, and it's a cable modem. A wireless router, a single wireless router, functions as a cable modem, as a router, as a switch, as a wireless access point, as a DHCP server, as a NAT server, and as a firewall. In a large organization, all of these components could be separate physical devices. However, in a small network, the wireless router can perform all of these functions. A virtual private network allows users to connect from home, but we will not discuss virtual private networks until we get to Chapter 12. Now let's look at remote administration using Telnet, page 525. Here's the situation. You're a consultant and you have a customer and they want you to come over there to create a couple new users and add users to a couple groups. And you don't want to drive over there. What you want to do is you want to remotely configure their server so you don't have to take all the time to drive over there, but you still bill them for it. So there are two ways to do that. You can use Telnet or you can use remote desktop. Telnet has been around for a long time. It uses a command line interface. With Telnet, I can be at my workstation here at Catonsville, and I can connect to a server over at the Essex campus, and any commands that I type on my workstation here would actually apply to that remote server, and I could create users and add users to groups on that server. To connect to the remote server, I would go to the command prompt and I would type Telnet followed by the IP address of the remote server. And then I would be connected to the remote server. And any commands that I would type here would not apply to my computer, but they would apply to the remote server. So if I were to type the command format space C:, it would not format the hard disk on my computer, but it would format the hard disk on the remote computer. I can use Telnet to remotely configure another server, create users, add users to groups, etc. Telnet uses a command line interface. You can also use remote desktop to remotely connect to a remote server to configure it, and that uses a graphical user interface. Remote desktop allows me at my workstation to connect to a remote server and to configure it, create users, add users to groups. But it uses a graphical user interface. So to connect to server 2, I would select remote desktop connection, and I would type connect to server2.ccbc.edu, type in the administrator's name, and I would click on connect. And then this would connect me to the remote server. Notice the window in the middle of my screen here. Any commands that I type in the middle of this window, which says remote desktop, any of these commands would actually apply to the remote server. So I have server manager here, and I could create users, create groups, and add users to groups. In my remote desktop window, I have a start button. If I click on the start button in the remote desktop window, then I will be starting programs on the remote computer. However, if I select the start button on the bottom left-hand corner of my own screen, then I would be starting programs on my own computer. Remote desktop allows me to remotely configure remote computers. So Telnet and remote desktop both allow us to perform remote administration. Telnet is harder because you have to know the command line interface, and you have to know what commands to type, but it's faster than the graphical user interface. It goes over the wire faster. Remote desktop is easier because it uses the graphical user interface, but it's a little slower as it goes over the wire. Chapter 11, Summary. In this chapter we discussed small business network design, selecting the type of network, hardware recommendations, system software, application software, communication software, communicating with the outside world, SOHO, wireless router, and remote administration. And this concludes Chapter 11. Thank you very much.